Joining us now to talk more about this initiative is the president of the Last Post Fund, Mr. Derek Sullivan. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
So tell us a little bit more about the Last Post Fund's Indigenous Veterans Initiative in particular.
Okay, well, as you mentioned, since 1909, the Last Post Fund has been providing funeral, burial, and grave marking for all veterans who lack the financial resources at the time of death. More recently, about 1995, we realized that there were thousands of veterans who were lying in unmarked graves across Canada. So our volunteers and our branches across the country started going to cemeteries and finding unmarked graves, and then we would place a grave marker on the grave. We were finding that it was often more difficult to find Indigenous veterans' graves, often because they were living in more remote communities, and the cultural connections were not necessarily there, and so we thought, well, we have to find a specific or special way to really find those graves, because we were quite sure there were many Indigenous veterans who were also in unmarked graves. So we assigned an individual to reach out to Indigenous communities across the country and find Indigenous researchers in those communities who could assist us in finding those unmarked graves. So we do two things. When we find an unmarked Indigenous veteran's grave, as we do with other unmarked veterans' graves, we will provide a grave marker for the grave. But in addition to that, where the Last Post Fund has already provided a marker for an Indigenous veteran's grave, we will also now add their traditional name to the Indigenous veterans marker. And the same goes for the unmarked graves, of course, where we can provide the Indigenous veterans name, traditional name, on the marker as well. So that's what we've specifically been doing with that. And we started that about a little less than 3 years ago, and it's been quite successful. We have already identified over 270 unmarked Indigenous veterans' graves, and we have either placed markers or have them currently on order for about 130 of those 270. And we've made connections with Indigenous communities across the country, and we have 23 Indigenous researchers who are assisting us in finding veterans' graves across the country. So as well, we've already been having requests for traditional names in six Indigenous languages.
All right, sir, just about 1:30 left in this interview. I'm going to jump to another question here. Tell us a little bit more about the importance of a final resting place for veterans in particular.
Well, it's important that we commemorate, that we remember the service of those who have stepped forward and joined the Canadian Armed Forces in times of war and in times of peace. And the most tangible way to remember that service of a particular individual is ensuring that when they do ultimately pass away, that their grave is marked by name, and that their community, their family can remember them and recognize them as someone who served the country.
All right, Mr. Sullivan, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily and sharing your important message.
Thank you very much. I'm most happy to do it.